Stanford University.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to have a chance to speak with you today. And Meg and I are going to kind of do a tag team talk, and then at the end we're going to try to leave you time for questions, and hopefully we can come up with some answers. So the Gulf of Mexico, we're going to focus on the oil spill, the recent event, but recognize that the Gulf of Mexico is already a marine ecosystem that's highly impacted by a variety of different human activities, including what was once the largest shrimp fishery and the highest dollar value fishery in the U.S., not so much anymore. Oil and gas, obviously. There's a large recreational fishing component that's extremely valuable in that system. Key habitats for a variety of different wildlife species. But the system's been also impacted by a lot of other factors like intensive nutrient loading, which leads to the hypoxia and one of the largest low oxygen dead zones in the world. And that's driven by flows from 42% of the continental United States and the Mississippi River drainage due to subsidence and so on, substantial wetland loss, and of course hurricanes. And so when you think about the Gulf of Mexico, you're just like, what else can go wrong? Gee, maybe an oil spill, maybe one of the largest spills that could ever happen. And so I'm going to recap a little bit of what happened with the spill, just to remind you of what was on film at 11, but also talk a little bit about the impacts on key species in this system. So the news first came to us about an explosion, which we subsequently learned killed 11 of the people who were working on the rig, and it was first taken as an accident, and we didn't know what the ultimate extent would be. Of course, the rig burned for something like 48 hours with huge attempts to try to cool things down. It turns out that you could see from satellite imagery where the rig was in the Mississippi Canyon and the plume of smoke that was coming from the rig. So, we're beginning to get at larger scales in terms of Gulf of Mexico impacts. The rig itself burned and sank to the ocean floor 2 days later. And then people began speculating, so what's going to happen with this oil rig? And we didn't fully know about the extent of the oil that was being dispersed from the rig and what the issues were in terms of this surge of oil. But again, from the satellite imagery, you could begin to pick up large oil plumes that were showing up at the surface just a few days after the spill. This is a really interesting graph that's extracted from one of those satellite images that shows the initial extent of the spill and the massive BP response to this, which is the little vessels that you see in the picture. They're like 4 or 6 vessels that are out there trying to surround this spill, and it was way too little, way too late to prevent much of the spill. And of course, the initial assessments were that the spill was a fairly low volume sort of thing. We were talking about like 1,000 barrels a day or something like that. But as people began to look at the extent of the spill and potentially the depth of the oil at the surface, they began to suspect those figures were way too low. An organization called SkyTruth, which was working from satellite imagery, and a physical oceanographer at Florida State University, estimated 1.1 million gallons per day, which, if true, would mean that we were at Exxon Valdez equivalents by May 1st. So 8 days, 10 days after the spill, we were already at something like 11 million gallons, and there's still debate that's going on with the presidential panel on just how much oil was spilled, and especially where that oil went, given that it's fairly easy to track oil that makes it to the surface. Once the decision was made to inject the dispersants at depth, then it was much more difficult to estimate where that oil might have gone in the Gulf of Mexico and at what depths it might reside. So again, from the satellite imagery, May 4th, so this is a couple weeks after the oil rig, we could begin to see oil slicks and oil sheens, which were becoming much larger in the system. And the major concern of most of the politicians, it seems, and certainly of BP, was about oil coming ashore on the land. And one reason for that concern is it creates damaging film at 11, so they were happy if the oil stayed further offshore. But in terms of impacts on the Gulf of Mexico ecosystem, oil further offshore can also be really problematic, and it's going to be years to decades before we know what that impact is going to be. It wasn't until May 12th that British Petroleum was pressured to release video of the oil that was coming out of the fractured pipes. And a lot of people went to work really fast on this video imagery to try to estimate what the rates were. And again, they jumped up about fourfold from 1.1 million gallons a day to 4.2 million gallons a day. And again, that estimate's still debated. But I think these images were what galvanized the public concern. It was just, pretty easy to say a lot of oil's coming out of the ocean floor. The other thing is that in terms of oil leaks of this kind, we're talking about at depths and at temperatures that we hadn't really dealt with before. And so familiar with the use of dispersants, but not in 5,000 meters of water. So it's pretty dramatic. I was not directly involved in this assessment, although I had done about 10 years of research in the Gulf of Mexico, particularly on nutrients and low oxygen. So I ended up on the reporter's list for someone to call to comment on what was going on. And one of the first comments I had with a reporter from AP who talked to me is they said, well, what do you think is going to be the effect on the biological system? And I said, well, the potential impacts on the wetland habitats and nursery habitats for a variety of different organisms in shallow water might be important, but I'm really concerned about the loop current. And the reporter said, what's the loop current? So you learn pretty fast how much people are aware of how the oceans work out there. And the loop current, as probably most of you know, is the Gulf of Mexico sort of precursor of the Gulf Stream, which wraps around the northern Gulf of Mexico and then goes down past the Florida Keys and becomes the Gulf Stream. And when this explosion first occurred, I was looking at the paper and I said, well, so the oil rig itself was I think 48 nautical miles from the nearest point on land. It was about 20 nautical miles from the average position of the loop current. So if you're thinking about it just dispersing in no particular direction, the potential for getting engaged in the loop current was pretty large. And this image by May 17th suggested some oil was starting to propagate to the south and east in approximately in the position that you might expect the loop current to take it. It turned out that we were fortunate in terms of the physical oceanography because occasionally the loop current, rather than looping around and going to the Gulf of Mexico, will actually spin off an eddy. And it did that. It spun off an eddy that was called Franklin, which actually sort of held oil offshore so that it didn't get fully engaged and end up, at least in large amounts, in the Florida Keys or on the Atlantic coast. So, one of the issues that people were concerned about was what are the impacts of this oil spill at this time of year on species of concern. And one of the species that people have been very concerned about are bluefin tuna. This shows a graphic produced on May 18th, so just about the time I showed you, and it shows the average position of the loop current. So you can see there where the loop current goes and how close it got to the oil spill as determined from satellite imagery, so oil at the surface. But the checkered area, the light blue area, is the habitat as determined from satellite imagery and tagging and so on, and larval sampling of bluefin tuna. And Atlantic bluefin tuna, our Barb Block from Stanford has been working on them for a long time, putting satellite tags on animals. It's known that they spawn in the Gulf of Mexico, and it's basically the main location of spawning for the western North Atlantic population. There's also a spawning that occurs in the Mediterranean. But it turns out that the oil spill was occurring at almost exactly the time and certainly in part of the space where these tunas actively spawn. So once again, is there an impact on the tuna populations? It's really difficult to tell because there's not an ongoing fishery independent assessment of tuna populations, right? And although you might have seen a dead tuna wash up on the shoreline, nobody saw that, but no one's ever going to see a dead larval tuna wash up on the shoreline. So your chances of sampling really small organisms, the potential impacts on larval fish and invertebrates, endangered or not, is something that basically we're going to have to wait for years to see what happens in that system. You can see that, again, there was more propagation and a lot of attention in the press to impacts on wetland habitat and so on, but also a lot of the oil was kept offshore and dispersed at depth in the water column. And most of the oil spill trajectory models depend on satellite imagery tuning surface physical oceanographic models to tell you where the oil is likely to go. If it's floating in the surface, if it's dispersed in 1,000 meters of water, it's any bets are off, for where it might go, because our understanding of the three-dimensional physics is not nearly as good. Again, there was continued spreading over time. At the largest extent, I think, before they began getting to the point where they put the cap on the well and so on, the estimate was 550 miles of oiled beaches and wetlands, but a much, much larger area of the Gulf of Mexico received oil for sure. One of the species that I had worked on in the Gulf of Mexico for years and years is Kemp's ridley sea turtle. Kemp's ridleys are, or were at one point, the most endangered turtle in the world in the mid-1980s. We were down to 800 nests, which is about 300 nesting females. And they nest in one place in the Gulf of Mexico, in Mexico itself. Over time, probably about 20 years, people worked really hard to rebuild this population, but it's still considered to be endangered. And because it nests at only one place in the world, something like a large oil spill can have a big impact. There were a lot of efforts to go out and recover animals that were oiled, and this is Kemp's ridley that was recovered. The number of seabirds and fishes and mammals and turtles that were recovered was pretty small in the Gulf of Mexico compared to something like the Prince William Sound. Part of that with seabirds is there are many fewer birds in the Gulf of Mexico than there are in Prince William Sound because of the differences in productivity in that system. But there was a lot of question marks around the efficacy of collecting these animals and cleaning them up and releasing them. And it tells you little, protecting individual animals, what the impact on the populations will be. So I just finished a stint with the National Research Council panel on population assessment of sea turtles, and we were trying to look at the question, can NOAA, can the federal agencies determine the impact of the oil spill on these turtle populations based on the information they have? And the short answer to that is no. It's going to be very difficult to attribute changes in the abundance of Kemp's ridleys or any other sea turtles, and I would extend that to probably most of the fishes and mammals and so on, as unequivocally linked to the oil spill. So, and part of that is just limitations of the data and the approach that the government's taken to try to understand the dynamics of long-lived species. If you have questions about that at the end of the talk, I'd be happy to talk some more about that. Mbari deployed one of their autonomous underwater vehicles in the Gulf of Mexico, and this vehicle had petroleum sensors on it, and what they were able to do by swimming that thing around was map subsurface plumes from the location of the wellhead. And I believe this is sort of to the north and the west, but you can see between 1,100 meters and 1,200 meters, a thick layer of oil that was, and oil products that were found at depth. This was at the same time that the newspapers were saying, oh no, we don't have any oil at depth, we don't have plumes in the water column, and at least 3 independent research groups have documented plumes in the water column. What we don't have is any kind of comprehensive map with where the oil went. And still the panel who's studying this is trying to figure out where did this oil go that did not end up at the surface, and what are its potential impacts. There was a New York Times article following up on a research paper published about impacts of oil on deep sea corals. This was just a few days ago. And so there are deep sea coral beds in the harm's way, basically, around where these deep water plumes are. And of course, the conventional wisdom with oil is that when you have a spill, it floats to the surface and it doesn't interfere with these organisms that are at depth. But deep sea corals are particularly problematic because they have extremely long lifespans, and it will be centuries probably before the corals that were damaged recover. We don't know about the extent of this impact, again, but we know that it occurred. The federal government did take action to try to reduce the impact on fisheries and on seafood products, and so NOAA took a very active role in closing fishing grounds that might have an impact. Basically, what they were trying to do was protect against concerns about the safety of eating seafood. So what they did was close large areas that they knew to be oiled for fishing so that people could feel comfortable about the seafood supply that was coming from the Gulf of Mexico. And given the importance of the commercial and the recreational fisheries, that was probably a really important move by NOAA. But they ended up closing a third of the fishing grounds in the Gulf of Mexico. And you can see the little star on the upper left there where the rig was. So very extensive areas that were considered. On the 4th of July, they also produced a threats map for where they thought oil was going to come ashore. And of course, the highest probability areas were the wetlands, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, panhandle of Florida. But they also expected that there was a reasonable possibility of Florida Keys and even the South Atlantic Bight getting some oil. This was a graphic that was available on YouTube that some physical oceanographers put together that's basically a hypothetical sort of thing based on average ocean climatology and currents for that time of year. If there's oil being spilled from the point of the well for 4 months, the question is, where would it go? And so this is very hypothetical, but it suggests that the oil could have gone extremely far. The empirical evidence doesn't suggest that it made dispersals this far, but the potential effect could be really broad. So it makes you think about the question, what is the footprint of an oil well? I mean, because usually for regulatory purposes, Meg can correct me if I'm wrong, but it's something like a mile around the oil rig is considered the footprint of the oil rig, and clearly we're not talking about that scale here. One of the things that should be clear is that the Deepwater Horizon spill is the largest accidental oil spill in history. The only larger spill was the one that was started by Saddam Hussein's troops after the Iraq War, where very large amount of oil was spilled in 1991. Again, we're still sizing up the Deepwater Horizon spill, but it was extremely large. And of course, one of the reactions that a lot of people might have to a spill of that magnitude is concern about oil drilling. And it was a really interesting conflict to listen to the governor of Louisiana, Bobby Jindal, calling for the federal government to come and stop the spill and rescue the economy of Louisiana. At the same time, he was pleading for reopening offshore drilling. So it becomes really difficult to understand, except that the economic model for Louisiana is very oil-based. And so it's very difficult for them to suddenly turn a corner and say, we're not going to worry about offshore drilling. It also might lead people in the US to say, well, offshore drilling is too risky. We don't want to do offshore drilling. The Gulf of Mexico, it took, I can't remember how many days it was, 3 months, 3.5 months to get that well capped. You think about how long it would take in the Arctic Ocean, which we're currently considering offshore drilling for. Much rougher oceanographic conditions. But if you're thinking, I don't want to drill for oil in the United States, you have to recognize that if we don't drill for oil in the United States, we get our oil from someplace else. One of the places that oil comes from that enters the US marketplace is Nigeria. And basically the track record for Nigeria is that they have the equivalent of Exxon Valdez spill every year for the last 50 years. I had a student from Nigeria at my lab last summer. And he was doing a PhD project on the oil exploration, which occurs largely in the Niger River Delta. And a lot of the spills are due to aging infrastructure where the oil companies simply haven't replaced the pumps and the pipelines and so on in that region. So there are a lot of accidental spills. He took some video of a big pipeline that had broken, that was leaking hundreds of gallons a day down a stream into a lake, and he posted it on CNN iReports. And the next day, the secret police came and took him away for 48 hours. And in Nigeria, you cannot come back from a visit from the secret police. So he was lucky to be released, but he decided to change his dissertation topic, if you can imagine. But one of the key issues about Nigeria and Venezuela and some of these other countries is they have far lower environmental protections than we do, but we import oil from them. So 10% of the oil that enters the US marketplace is from Nigeria that has these chronic spills. So every time you fill your gas tank, 2 gallons came from Nigeria. So if you say we're not going to drill for oil in the United States, you have to recognize that the burden, the environmental burden, may just be dumped over to some other country less able to defend itself.
So Larry's statement about how Nigeria has far less environmental review than we do only makes me more depressed, because what I'm going to actually walk you through is just some really basic aspects of our regulatory system for offshore oil and gas drilling in the United States. And from my point of view, it's a pretty relaxed system. I should also mention that what I'm going to do right here is going to be pretty brief, and we have a couple of talks coming up on campus on the 16th and on the 30th, and on November 30th at 7:30 and Hewlett 200. I'm going to give a much more expanded talk about offshore oil and gas regulation in the United States and how that affected or how it affects our review and expediting oil and gas exploration in the Gulf. And I got kind of sucked into this whole exercise because I got a couple calls to come back and testify on the oil spill and to provide some insights on what is normally required under federal law for environmental review and the extent of environmental review that was actually provided for the Deepwater Horizon rig. So my talk has really uninteresting graphics compared to Larry's, so I had to add a few animations just to try to juice it up a little bit. But I'm going to just give you a really quick and dirty on how we regulate this industry. And essentially, what we do under a federal statute called the Offshore Continental Shelf Lands Act is we break down the whole process of offshore oil and gas drilling into these 4 stages. The Macondo well made it to this stage, and that was the point at which everything blew up, and it sank actually on Earth Day, oddly enough, April 22nd. But I'll take you all the way through stage 4 just so you can get a sense of how this works in the United States and how it works for the Gulf of Mexico. This first stage is really interesting. This is a stage at which our federal agency, who is charged with responsibility for overseeing this whole system, then called the Minerals Management Service under the Department of Interior, and now it's called something else, for which the acronym says something like BUMR, B-O-E-M-R, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management and something else. But suffice it to say, the Department of Interior is the ultimate agency that is responsible for overseeing this whole process. And so in this first stage, the pre-lease process, they actually undertake every 5 years, a 5-year plan. They develop a 5-year plan for how we're going to pursue offshore oil and gas drilling in all of the the U.S. waters. So U.S. waters extend 200 nautical miles offshore. And the area that is depicted by this boundary here is the area that in this last 5-year review that the Department of Interior was looking at. It's a vast, vast area. And they take it through what is a fairly very sort of 50,000-foot level environmental review process, because you can imagine when you're looking at geographies as different as Alaska and Florida and California and the Carolinas all the way up to the Gulf of Maine, you've got, completely different ecosystems that you're looking at, and completely different oil reservoirs and potential. And you're trying to develop this 5-year plan that would encompass all of these geographies. So the environmental review process is called an environmental impact statement that is developed for this 5-year program, contains really general information about the biogeography and the nature of the environmental assets that exist in this whole vast set of regions, and deals very superficially, I would say, with the potential for impacts on these systems. It's meant to be this sort of 50,000-foot level review of what could possibly happen with respect to significant impacts on these geographies. At the end of this process, where you see there are brief comment periods that are not particularly long, this 5-year program is finally announced. And then at stage 2, the Department of Interior's Bureau, the Minerals Management Service at the time, then undertakes what it calls a multi-lease sale process. And this is the point at which they put on their red jackets and they actually hold an auction to auction off portions of our national waters so that companies can move forward with developing exploration plans and actually put in things like the Macondo well to find out how much is actually going to be able to be removed. And at this point, the lease sale area for the Macondo well is actually huge. What they did is they consolidate several potential leases together, this multi-lease sale. It covers an area the size of Montana at this point, and they develop another environmental impact statement to cover the potential impacts associated with this Montana-sized area where lease sale 206 was included. And they go through the process. I should say that at this stage, the Department of Interior is obligated to consult with the Department of Justice and the governors from the states within whose waters the lease sale is going to take place. And they're required to consult with the Department of Justice because they want to make sure that there are no potential antitrust problems associated with the lease sales. And they're obligated to consult with the governors because the governors do have an opportunity to weigh in on whether or not they feel that this would pose a unique problem for the state with respect to environmental impacts, economic impacts, social impacts, you name it. They are not obligated at this point, however, to consult with, under their interpretation, to consult with other federal agencies who are in a position to be able to tell the Department of Interior whether or not there are significant environmental impacts that they should be considering at this stage. So what you have is the Department of Interior's small bureau whose obligation is to really pursue and expedite oil exploration in sort of its own sort of capsule here. And one could argue that under our National Environmental Policy Act, they should be thinking about consulting with the US EPA, with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, with the US Fish and Wildlife Service, with the U.S. Coast Guard about the potential for impacts to the natural assets in the area. But they're not obligated to do it at this point. So they go through what is another version of an environmental impact statement that is supposed to be even more specific than this very general one here. What I noticed as I was looking through all the environmental documentation through the process, however, is that as the Department of Interior moved through this process, their environmental impact review appeared to become less specific, not more specific. So the normal progression that you see in cases where they have more of a programmatic level environmental impact statement, moving down to a specific project level environmental impact statement, that normal progression, in fact, appeared to be reversed. This is just showing the size of the Lease Sale 206, which is quite large. It's encompassing state waters from Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. And I just also want to remark that Larry mentioned that over what's like 550 miles of coastline were actually affected. That's roughly half California's coastline. It's a large area. Now let me take you to the third stage. This is this exploration plan stage where at this point, BP has purchased their lease. They're going to be proposing exploration of a particular segment of the lease and putting in these exploration wells like the Macondo well. And what normally happens here is it's not assumed that you're going to do an environmental impact statement. Instead, what the Department of Interior is supposed to do is do an assessment to figure out whether or not there's any potential for environmental impacts, significant environmental impacts. If not, it can skirt any further environmental review. If they do perceive that there may be some environmental impacts, then they do a focused EIR that just really looks into those impacts. So, for example, they might look at, if they had consulted with NIMFs or with NOAA, they would probably have learned that bluefin tuna were spawning in the area on a seasonal basis, a very predictable basis, and they might think about the potential for impacts on that population. That wasn't done. And what happens under the federal law that governs offshore oil and gas drilling is that there's an exception provided for exploration and drilling in the Gulf of Mexico under the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act. And that exception was actually adopted in 1979 in the wake of the 70s oil crisis. And it basically says you don't need to do an environmental assessment here. Instead, you can just get a categorical exclusion for offshore oil and gas drilling in the Gulf of Mexico. So it creates a much reduced environmental review process for exploration and drilling in the Gulf of Mexico. And I've kind of referred to this as sort of creating a sacrifice zone for the Gulf through this federal statute. The stage 4 process we never got to with the Macondo well, but I just wanted to point out to you some other deviations from the normal environmental review that occurs. Whoops, see, I'm showing you that. Okay. This is my really fancy animation going on here. There's a document that is introduced through the federal statute. It's called a Doc D. It's actually a foreshortened document that allows you to move forward with development and production quickly with minimal environmental review or no environmental review. You get another exclusion from doing any kind of environmental impact statement if you're in the Gulf of Mexico. And you don't have to go through the more extensive paperwork and production of reporting. So I guess what I wanted to impress on you is that, first of all, the Gulf of Mexico, by virtue of the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act, actually gets special treatment that was specifically intended, and you can see it in the legislative history, to expedite and facilitate drilling in that region. And that the kind of review that the Department of Interior followed in this case actually is, in general, a deviation for how the environmental impact statement process is supposed to proceed. So how would we do things differently? Well, one thing we would do is try to impress on all of our agencies who are engaged in the process of managing our coastal and ocean resources that we actually, it's a new day in the United States. We have a president who has issued an executive order in July of 2009 that actually established a national ocean policy. It requires all federal agencies to actually take measures to ensure the enhancement and protection of our marine and coastal resources. And they're supposed to harmonize this policy with their pre-existing statutory mandates and responsibilities. So if you're thinking about harmonizing that policy with this process, honestly, you probably would deal with the environmental impact review process a little differently than the Department of Interior actually did in this case. The second thing that I think needs to be changed is requirements for consultation through every stage of the process, especially in stage 2. Because it's at stage 2 where you're doing that multi-sale lease. You're doing the actual selling of whole slices of the Gulf of Mexico to companies, essentially, to pursue exploration and ultimately development. This is the point at which companies are putting money on the table and they've got investment-backed expectations. This is the point at which you really do want to understand what potential impacts are involved, what kind of measures need to be taken to avoid those impacts, and whether or not you even want to put some portions of the marine real estate on the table for leasing. Are they just too vulnerable? Are they just too special and important for a particular species that we value in other areas of our life, for example? So one way of doing this is simply to require consultation with the sister trustee agencies in the federal government, at least at this stage. I should also mention that there's really significant evidence that NOAA and some of the other federal agencies did try to engage in consultation at this stage, and were not particularly successful. The other thing I would do is kind of blow up a few of the boxes. I would get rid of the categorical exclusions. It says you don't even have to undertake any kind of environmental impact review. It's an assumption that there are no impacts in the works or no potential impacts. I would probably be a little bit more careful about the scope of the lease sales. We're talking about, again, areas the size of Montana and Ohio. And think about whether it's even possible to honestly evaluate environmental impacts if you're talking about a geography that size. And I certainly would deal with tiering of the environmental impact reviews differently and going from more general to much more specific rather than going from more general to even more general. The final thing that I would add is a stage 0 and a stage 5. So Larry kind of talked a little bit about this. All the information that Larry presented earlier about the uniqueness of the Gulf of Mexico and certainly the extent of the wetlands in the area, over 5 million acres of wetlands. It's the largest extent of wetlands in the lower 48. Major flyway for migrating waterfowl, really important for about 20 threatened and endangered species, 2021, including the turtles that Larry mentioned, the bluefin tuna, sperm whales, the list goes on and on. And at the very least, you'd want to start with a really sort of a basic knowledge of the geography that you're dealing with. What does the ecosystem look like? What's the bathymetry look like? If an oil spill occurs, where is that spill likely to go? What's the oceanography of the area? Does a loop current exist or not? And what would that do? What does that tell you about where you might place exploration wells or full-fledged development? And think about whether or not there are some places in the Gulf of Mexico, for example, where you simply should not be engaging in this kind of activity. So is there a way to sort of spatially arrange human activities in a geography like the Gulf that makes more sense for the human activities and more sense for the ecosystems there? And then I would add a stage 5, which is a really sort of careful look at spill response. We know from the newspapers that the oil spill response plans that were prepared for the Gulf were just cookie cutter response plans that were shared throughout the United States. Basically the same response plan for the Gulf was the one that was used in Alaska. And we know enough about the Gulf of Mexico to realize that you need a very different response plan for this area, especially given the unique attributes like the loop current. So I would look at this more from a systems analysis point of view and probabilistic risk assessment, where you've got a whole system to take into account. Everything from the blowout preventer to all the human systems that are involved here and the different points at which things can go terribly wrong, and understanding how you would respond when things do go wrong at these different junctures. And I think peer review, I always want to throw that in. That's my final slide. I want to make sure we have plenty of time for questions. So. Yeah.
A lot of people were comparing the Deepwater Horizon spill with the Ixtoc spill and saying that, as opposed to Valdez, because the waters in the Gulf of Mexico are warmer and certain other factors, the effects or the impacts of Ixtoc are actually much lower than expected. So the same thing might happen with the Deepwater Horizon spill. Could you just address how legitimate that claim is?
Yeah, I took a look at a lot of the old Ixtoc predictions and responses, and it turns out that one of the key issues is that the assessment before the Ixtoc spill and after was not very thorough. And if we're going to learn from these events, we actually need to do that actively and say, we need to learn from this event. And so there are a variety of different reports, like shrimp fisheries collapsing for 4 or 5 or 6 years. And you might say, not to worry, they're back. But for the fishermen that were fishing in those fisheries, they're done for quite a long period of time. In terms of oil accumulation in the sediment, there's oil from the Ixtoc spill which is still in the sediment. It's gotten buried, so it may not be, and a lot of the more biologically active elements have weathered out and things like that. So the impacts of that spill aren't entirely gone. There's a guy at, I think, Texas A&M, West Tunnel, who was actually a young faculty member when the Ixtoc spill went, and he went and did some evaluations. And he was in the press a lot talking about this spill, saying, yeah, 25 years later, no big deal. And you say, well, 25 years later is a long time. So I think that we have some advantages in the Gulf of Mexico over other locations. The water is warm. There are natural petroleum seeps in the Gulf of Mexico, so there's also a natural flora of bacteria that can process some of the hydrocarbons, including some of the short-chain hydrocarbons that are most toxic and things like that. So in a way, the Gulf of Mexico, if you're going to have an oil spill, this might be the place to do it compared to cold water systems. But it's still the largest spill in the history of oil exploration. So it's a very, very big event. And I think in many cases, we're in the same place we were with Ixtoc. It's going to be hard to assess unequivocally what the effect of the spill is. In fact, I was working with this National Research Council panel on sea turtles. We basically said, we concluded it's impossible for the federal government to assess the effects of the spill on turtles. They simply don't have the data to do that. And it's not a matter of expertise. Nobody could do it with the information that they've been collecting. So my real concern is about whether we learn from these events or we just say, well, that was an accident and no big deal when the next one occurs. And it's, I think with our hunger for oil, probability equals 1 that we're going to have events like this in the future. So can we be better prepared? I think the answer to that is yes, but we'll see if there's willingness to do that.
Yeah.
Meg, I guess I would explore a little bit with your stage 5 oil spill response planning. I think chronologically that needs to happen
Oh, I don't disagree with you.
Say
Yeah.
1.5 maybe.
Right, right.
Before you let the leases go.
Yeah, you know what? The only reason why that's a really good point, and I won't put it there in the future because I totally agree with you. It's just really, that's where typically you end up using the oil spill response plan, but it has to be something that's prepared with the exploration plan, actually. That's where it goes. And, you know, I suppose one interesting exercise would be if you're honestly, you know, preparing an oil response plan, you really don't know how to prepare a useful oil response plan if you have no idea what the condition of the ecosystem is at that time. It's very hard to know whether burning is a good idea, or applying dispersants is a good idea, or booming is a good idea, or freshwater diversion is a good idea. All of those have very significant impacts, and one of the concerns that a lot of the folks who are studying the Gulf and have known it for a really long time, people who have been involved in Gulf restoration efforts for, you know, decades, is that they're concerned that some of the cleanup measures that were undertaken might actually end up being more harmful to the ecosystem than the oil itself.
Yeah, I guess I don't want to be too cute here, but watching the press coverage, it was like the Keystone Cops respond to an oil spill. I mean, the various things that were suggested did not provide much confidence that they had a plan for what to do. And I think that there's a real risk that when you don't have a plan, suggestions that come up for which there's a lot of political pressure make sense. One of my favorites was Governor Jindal's proposal to build berms in front of the wetlands, and they got a whole bunch of money to go build berms in front of the wetlands. Had they been effective at doing that, which would be really hard to do because geologically, if berms could be there, they would be there. But if you were effective at doing that, what would happen is the marshes would go fresh and it would kill all the marsh grass that's there. So like, duh. Why was that a sensible solution? Well, it was something that some local politicians suggested, and it was just pressure to do this. Had they succeeded, they would have killed more marsh by freshwater intrusion than by oil, I think. So it really is important to think about how you're going to respond to various kinds of threats and what your plan A, B, C are. And I guess one of the things that I still don't know the answer to is who approved the use of dispersants at depth. I presume EPA signed off on that. But you know, it's not something we have experience with. So it's like we just did a big experiment in the Gulf of Mexico, and we may or may not learn from it.
Yeah.
What was the effect of the 2009 executive order on the 1979 legislation? Did it modify it at all? And I mean, there's been a lot of enhancement in the drilling technology to allow going down 2,600 feet or so, which wasn't covered in the 1979 legislation. What's going on in terms of bringing things up to date?
Yeah, that's a great question. It really appeared to have no effect whatsoever. Now, in the wake of that 2009 executive order, there's an interagency task force that was formed to look into how implementation of the policies contained in that order, to investigate the promise of marine spatial planning and trying to, you know, proactively thinking ahead about human activities and where we should be doing what. And I don't want to undermine the importance of that interagency task force because it's really the first time that our federal agencies have been met consistently, you know, together, very, very top level representatives from each of the agencies to talk about these things. But you know, they just basically it was about a year's worth of meetings, and they completed their work. And yesterday was the first day that our new National Ocean Council, which is sort of a semi-duplication of the Interagency Task Force, met for the first time. So the federal system takes a while to digest these new directives, and so we're seeing this all play out right now.
And I think that you know, updates. The idea of the new national ocean policy is not that the agencies in the Department of Interior wouldn't still manage oil exploration. They would, but they'd manage it in the context of a larger plan. 24 federal ocean science agencies are currently trying to enact or put in place 140 laws. So it's very confusing about who's responsible for what. And so it's really a context setting thing. I would say in terms of oil exploration, what we need is a national energy policy, which obviously has been debated for quite a while. And what will be the role of oil exploration in the context of a comprehensive energy policy? I mean, that's something that we should sort out, and people, again, don't seem to be willing to clarify that. But if there were a national energy policy, part of that would be linked to the national ocean policy to the degree that the energy provisioning is coming from the ocean, whether it's tidal or wind or oil and gas.
Oh, I don't know. You choose now.
Yeah.
I was just wondering, in the bidding process for the leases, are the environmental response and considerations taken into account when the companies do their bids, or is it all just based on who's going to pay more money for the lease?
Yeah, it's a competitive leasing process, and there's really high motivation to bring in maximum revenue at that point. So while the Department of Interior is supposed to have undertaken that, very high-level environmental review, and they did. It was a very high-level review. Their interest at the lease sale stage is really extending those leases, getting them purchased, so that exploration can move forward, and the environmental review that they actually undertake in that process is fairly superficial.
Yep. And the other point, the reason why MMS disappeared was it was both responsible for the environmental review and the lease sale.
Yes.
So the same agency was trying to sell these leases and providing the environmental oversight, and that was pretty close to being one agency. It's now separated, but we'll see how it functions. The other thing that a lot of people don't know is that oil lease revenue is the #2 source of revenue to the United States after individual income tax. So if you follow the money, you shouldn't wonder why oil and gas is so important in the U.S. Major source of revenue. Yep.
I'm in a project infrastructure class, and the universal complaint, whether it's a solar power facility or rail, is that the EIS process is really burdensome and it hurts.
Wasn't here.
Well, my question is there a way to maybe meet the same timeline with a better and produce a better EIS, or is there a way to
Yes.
have a faster EIS and a better EIS?
Yeah, we actually, Larry and I totally concur on this, and that stage 0 is the point. Really, that assessment of, just if the Department of Interior is looking at the Gulf of Mexico, which it is on a regular basis, for additional oil and gas drilling or any other energy project for that matter, if they know ahead of time what the condition of the Gulf is, what the baseline condition is, even in its very degraded state right now, which, there's serious issues going on with the Gulf. They understand what the bathymetry is, the oceanography is, they understand which animals are using the Gulf, at what seasons. They can start to make some really well-informed decisions about what kinds of technologies are appropriate, when activities should be taking place, where they should be taking place in the Gulf, and we call all of that spatial planning. So it's starting with a good piece of information, an assessment of the geography that you're targeting, and then with that information, making some really informed decisions about what should go where proactively rather than reactively. So if you do that right, that all is front-loaded decision-making. The permitting that flows from that can be very targeted. You're not asking for leases in places that you shouldn't be. You're not wasting your time in areas where your particular facility shouldn't be located anyways. You've got presumptions set up that you should be going in other areas, and you've got baseline environmental information, which is the kind of information that each individual project applicant needs to dredge up on their own. Now you've got a common database that you can access for that information. So that's what we envision.
And I guess the key point is here, right now, each application has to do their own EIS and pool their own data, and it's the same data. So if you're talking about fisheries or oil and gas exploration or wind in the Gulf of Mexico, you need to have the same underlying information about the distribution of resources and bathymetry and currents and all that kind of thing. And each group has to do their own EIS for their project. The idea of a marine spatial plan, as this thing rolls forward, is that the marine spatial plan becomes a programmatic EIS and designates where certain activities are most reasonable to occur. And that way, if you're proposing a particular activity like offshore aquaculture, if there's a place in the Gulf of Mexico for offshore aquaculture, you have to do an EIS for siting in that location, but there's already a programmatic EIS that says it's okay for there to be offshore aquaculture in some locations in the Gulf of Mexico. So I think that we do have to think about the process and not make it incredibly tedious for business. Otherwise, they'll do things like take all the oil exploration to another country, and what we do is export the problem, the environmental problem, and import the product, which the U.S. does all the time, but we have to recognize there's some ethical responsibility there. Yep.
There are dollars on the line, and what we do in energy services procurement, so an ESCO scenario is take that component called the investment grade analysis, and we put the burden on the proposers, and we create a narrow group who then invest in that IGA, and that becomes a really critical piece of the platform that we evaluate to give them money in the procurement. So if we are on the procuring side, or in this case on the regulatory side, you want to burden them somewhat with an economic analysis, which is done through the actuarial process, the amortization process, and the risk analysis process, coupled with this plan, which I'm really fascinated. I'd like to hear more about it.
So I think just a couple of things. It's really, if I teach land use and know a lot about how land development happens, and it's very common practice to have studies done where the cost recovery is taken care of with the applicants, whether or not they're successful through the permit process. And so you can imagine constructing a system like that. One of the problems that I see with this large-scale, proactive assessment is agency capacity, the capacity within our federal agencies to actually undertake this kind of work. And if you look behind the curtains on Department of Interior and Minerals Management Service, their capacity to even understand the technology that was employed here was very limited, let alone the potential environmental impacts and really having a handle on the ecosystem within which they were permitting lots of activity. So I think we do have to take a fairly cautious approach here.
So your consulting platform, integrating the consultant into that process.
Exactly, and making sure that the consultants have independence and credibility in that process, because this was an industry in a geography where they were very much in control of the regulatory process, and this region of MMS was quite remarkable, even as difficult as that might seem, because MMS has problems, all over the place, but this region had its own special problems in that regard.
Are we done? Okay. Last question back there.
Is there any incentive for the industry to self-regulate?
Oh, they're really interested in self-regulating. I testified before. Pardon me? And there are some examples of that, actually. I was asked to testify before the National BP Deepwater Horizon Commission that is coming out with a report by January, I guess, with recommendations for, how we should be doing things differently. And the panel, one of the panels before me were different industry groups talking about how they engage in different levels of self-regulation. The nuclear industry, the chemical industry, and there are really great lessons to be learned from these different industrial sectors about how they cope, like post-Bhopal, with self-regulation and developing standardization and watchdogging themselves. So I don't think it's anything to scoff at, especially where you have such an imbalance of capacity. And there are great models out there. It'll be really interesting to see what the National Commission concludes, having looked at all of these different models, because I know they're looking at them really carefully.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.